Welcome to another week of American government with a very happy Mr. Lucas, not because this week is Halloween, but because once Halloween is over, we move on to my favorite holiday, Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is awesome. I get to eat tons of great food and watch football all day. I mean, what's more American than that? Being able to eat food, increase your cholesterol, and your chances of dying heart disease all in one day. But Thanksgiving also has a pretty cool historical significance that matters to most government teachers, and that's the fact that George Washington proclaimed Thursday, November 26, 1789, as a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate this. The U.S. Constitution. I mean, can't you just picture it? The year 1789, everyone's gathering together at the dinner table to eat Thanksgiving dinner, and they're being thankful for this new Constitution that's been created. Then suddenly, Uncle Joe down at the end of the table says, "You guys are thankful for this thing? This thing sucks. I didn't lose my left leg in the war just so that everyone could turn around and make a government that's pretty much the same thing I fought against." And someone else at the other end of the table says, "Yeah, remember when I could barely buy bread because of those trade wars that occurred under the Articles of Confederation? And remember those rebels in Shays' Rebellion that burnt down Uncle Ted's house? There's no way we should ever give the states that much amount of power again. This Constitution will fix that. You anarchist, monarchist." And then that Thanksgiving probably ended like most Thanksgivings do today when politics are brought up. And so, yeah, I'm pretty confident that's what Thanksgiving in 1789 was like. But that whole debate around whether or not this is actually a good governing document or not still exists today. And that is what we're going to talk about today. So let's recap what we've been over so far with the Constitution. Article 1 talks about the legislative branch, and the legislative branch is made up of Congress, which is a bicameral legislature, meaning it has two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Those are supposed to be the people's representatives. Well, at least originally just the House was. As the people's representatives, they are supposed to make the laws to govern the nation. Then there's Article 2, which talked about the executive branch, which is made up of the president, the vice president, and the cabinet. They're in charge of enforcing the laws. And we saw that the big thing in Article 2 was that the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Article 3 discusses the Supreme Court and the federal courts, which are supposed to interpret the laws and settle disputes. Then Article 4 talks about the relationships between the states. Article 5 talks about how the Constitution can be changed and amendments can be added to it. Article 6 simply mentions that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And Article 7 talks about how the Constitution will be ratified. So I haven't mentioned much about Article 7. That's because usually that's not something you need to memorize. But for the purpose of today, it's at least important to know that after the Constitution was created, it needed ratification, that is formal or final approval, by the states. You might recall from my lesson from like a month ago that I had mentioned the Founding Fathers went to Philadelphia to alter the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they emerged with an entirely brand new document. And so they thought, well, since we created a brand new document from scratch, we might want to get all the states' approval on this one. So they made copies of the Constitution and then they shipped it out to all of the state legislatures, which remember is basically the state governments, for them to take a look at it, debate on it, and then hopefully eventually vote for it. Remember, I mentioned this last week. This shows you that the federal government is getting its powers from the states. It's the states that are approving and consenting to delegate these powers to the federal government if they approve of the Constitution. Some of the states, upon receiving their delegation back from the Constitutional Convention, were handed this new document and said, "Oh, great. All right, let's see what you changed about the Articles of Confederation. Wait a second. This is not the Articles of Confederation at all. You guys didn't change anything, but this is completely different." Suddenly, throughout the entire United States, there became a whole debate about whether or not the Constitution should be ratified or not. And there were two camps that emerged out of that debate. The Federalists, who were for the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who were anti-Constitution. They did not want the Constitution at all. They wanted to stick with the Articles of Confederation. The Federalists wanted this new strong central government the Constitution created, which was called the federal government, hence the name Federalist. The Anti-Federalists would type up their arguments and they would publish them in newspapers or in pamphlets, and they called them the Anti-Federalist papers, whereas the Federalists did the same exact thing, but just with arguments defending the Constitution. And those arguments were published in pamphlets and newspapers, and they were called the Federalist papers. Some of the Anti-Federalist authors were well-known folks like Samuel Adams, while some of the Federalist authors were well-known names like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who really didn't write that many but still gets credit, like, most group projects. So we're going to break down some of the biggest arguments against the Constitution. And you might be thinking, well, wait a second, Mr. Lucas, again, why do we have to know that? Well, some of the arguments against the Constitution and predictions about how it wouldn't work have eerily come true. The arguments that were used to defend the Constitution are even used today by Supreme Court justices who are strict constructionists or originalists to better understand the original meaning and context surrounding the Constitution so that they know how to apply the Constitution. And as we learned a few weeks ago, you know that the Supreme Court's decisions can absolutely have an impact on how much government intervenes itself into your life. So let's get to it, and let's take a look at some of the arguments against Article 1 of the Constitution. For the Anti-Federalists, the biggest thing that rang alarm bells for them was Article 1, Section 8, which we went over a few weeks ago, and that lists the powers of Congress. The Anti-Federalists were particularly concerned over the broad powers the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause gave Congress. They were worried that the wording was too vague and that eventually over time Congress would keep granting itself more and more power and justify those powers under the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. They were worried that someday Congress might eventually argue that they can regulate anything that affects interstate commerce. Now that hasn't happened at all, has it? Oh wait, yeah, that's right, it has. The Anti-Federalists feared that this would be used to increase the power of the federal government over the states, and you all saw an example of that in that case I shared a few weeks ago, Gonzalez versus Reich, where that lady was trying to grow medicinal marijuana in her backyard and she was allowed to under California law, but federal law said it was illegal. So federal agents came in and they burnt all of her marijuana plants to the ground. That went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court used the Commerce Clause to side with the federal government. At the time, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were like, whoa, we hear you, Anti-Federalists, but we got this. We know you guys are concerned about this federal government getting too strong and powerful to the point where it becomes tyrannical, but slow your roll. There's a few things to prevent that from happening. Number one, checks and balances. No one branch of the government has all the power. In fact, there's almost a separation of powers, and each branch is designed to check the other branches from getting too powerful. And if you don't think separation of powers and checks and balances is enough to limit the government, on top of that, we also have federalism. So not only is there like a horizontal division of power, there's also a vertical division of power where the states also have some responsibilities and powers of their own. So if they don't like things the federal government is doing, they can almost counteract what the federal government's doing. In fact, James Madison argued that because of federalism, a double security arose to the rights of the people. What the heck does that mean? Well, let's say that this is you and this hammer here is government tyranny. Madison is arguing that there's already a lot of checks and balances and separation of powers in the national government. And that in and of itself is a lot to protect you from tyranny abusing your rights. Madison's also saying that if you don't think checks and balances and separation of powers inherent in the national government is enough to keep you safe, there's a whole other layer that tyranny has to get through, the state government. Hence, a double security arises to protect the rights of the people from government tyranny. The Anti-Federalists weren't convinced, and they thought that the Commerce Clause was still going to give the federal government too much power over the states. On top of that, they said, hey, hold up, Federalists. There's this thing in Article 6 here that says that the Constitution and the laws of the federal government are supreme over the states. It's called like the Supremacy Clause. How do you explain that? And the Federalists are kind of like, yeah, this is actually where we disagree a little bit, because we do think the federal government should have more power over the states. I mean, did you see Shays' Rebellion and the Articles of Confederation and all of that chaos? As if they still weren't convinced, James Madison then talks about the concept of popular sovereignty, which, if you remember, that's the idea that the people ultimately rule, that government gets its power from the consent of the governed. And James Madison says, well, if the government ever gets tyrannical, the people can simply vote those bums out of office. If the people control the government and the government becomes abusive, wouldn't that mean that the people are abusing themselves? This leads the the Anti-Federalists to their next argument, that it's not that simple, that you can't think of the United States as one monolithic group of people. The United States is diverse. It has lots of different cultures and belief systems and values and different types of people. And the Anti-Federalists said it's wrong to force all of these different groups of people to live under one central government that might try to enforce one set of values, beliefs, and norms onto everyone. In fact, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists both feared something called a faction. And a faction is a group of self-interested individuals who use the government to get what they want, trampling the rights of others in the process. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton both said, you know what, you guys are right. Factions are something we should be worried about. It would be bad if one faction took control of the national government and trampled on the rights of the minority. But James Madison argued that you can't eliminate factions without also trampling on people's rights and their freedom. The government can't stop people from trying to get involved and get some power in the government. After all, King George III in the British Parliament did try to eliminate the faction of colonists that wanted independence. To do that, they had to trample on their rights. So Madison had an idea. He said, if we can't eliminate factions, we can at least control their effects. And the way to do that is to have a really large republic, a really large country with lots of different factions. And all of those factions will be competing for power, and it will stop any one faction from dominating. So in other words, Madison was arguing that a large central government that controlled lots of different regions with lots of different diverse opinions and diverse thoughts and different factions would be better, because then all of those different factions would compete for power in that central government, and it would be less likely that any one faction could take control and dominate and trample on the rights of others. The idea of different factions competing for power so that not one faction dominates is sometimes a lot like the crab in the bucket mentality. If you've ever observed crabs in a bucket, you'll notice that the moment one crab tries to escape the bucket, the other crabs beneath it will grab it and pull it back down.
Crab mentality. Hold each other down. Nobody ever makes it out. Get them fighting. You ain't getting out. If I can't get out, you can't get out.
This is like what Madison hoped would happen with a bunch of different factions. Once one faction starts to get out of line and run away with too much power, the other factions are there to bring it back down. The Anti-Federalists, again, weren't completely convinced by that argument, because they feared if there were so many factions competing for power that it would cause gridlock where nothing would get done. And in desperation, government would then try to expand its power to actually do something. The Anti-Federalists looked at history, and they felt like the most tyrannical governments in history were ones that ruled over a very large population of people and over a large area of land. For the Anti-Federalists, smaller governments, more local governments that ruled over fewer people were far better. Why? Well, for one, they're closer to the people. They're more representative of the people. They know the people better because it's a smaller area. I mean, think about it in terms of classroom sizes. In a classroom of 30, I don't really have that much time to get around to each student individually and get to know them and get to know how they learn and get to give them one-on-one help. But in a classroom of 10 or 15, I have a lot more time to be able to go around and get to know each student one-on-one. I have a lot more flexibility to be able to learn who they are and tailor the lessons to them. Because of that, teachers are usually more effective when they have a smaller class, and the students benefit from that. Whereas a class of 30 plus students, some students are going to inevitably fall through the cracks. Of course, I know there are those of you out there that would never want to be talked to and want to be left alone, in which case you might like that bigger class. So the Anti-Federalists were afraid that a very large national government that ruled over a lot of different regions of a lot of different people would be farther detached from the people. And the farther detached the government was, the more likely it would be tyrannical, and the harder it would be for the people to rein it back in if they felt it was becoming tyrannical. I mean, let's think about it. President Trump represents 300 million Americans. Your 2 U.S. senators represent 11 million Ohioans. Even your representative to the House of Representatives represents 800,000 Americans. So when it comes to the national government, you are just one voice, one person out of hundreds of thousands or millions of people that those representatives have to consider when they're making decisions. Let's compare all that to the state government. Your representative to the Ohio House of Representatives represents about 100,000 people. Let's make it even more local. Go down to the city government. Your city officials or your mayor may represent maybe about like 15,000 people. So the smaller the government, the more local it is, the fewer amount of people it represents, means that that government is likely more accessible, that when you vote in elections, your vote is going to carry more weight than if you're one of just 300 million people that have a say in something. I can tell you from experience, if I try to contact one of our representatives in the federal government about an issue, then usually it takes them a long time to get back to me because they represent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And that's a lot of emails and letters that they have to go through. But if I contact a state or a local politician about an issue, they can get back to me pretty quickly because they don't represent as many people. In fact, I even know some local politicians and I can just talk to them directly about an issue I might have. Federalists said, yeah, we hear you. In fact, our system of government wants to allow the states to still have some ability to do that and to govern a lot of things. But the smaller the government is, the more likely one faction will rule it and dominate it, and there won't be as many factions there to try to counteract it. But the Anti-Federalists still didn't like the idea that representatives from one region of the country, which might be very different from other regions, would get a majority in the federal government and then be able to rule and dictate the laws, the rules, and the customs that those other regions had to follow. They didn't like the idea of a California hippie being able to pass laws and rules that a rural country bumpkin in Alabama would have to follow, or vice versa. After all, like-minded people tend to stick together. That's why on political maps you often see Democrats located in the cities and then Republicans located out in the countrysides. So if you've ever thought to yourself, why don't we just take all the liberals and move them to one area where they can govern themselves and not interfere with anyone else, and take all of the conservatives and move them to one area and they can just govern themselves and they don't have to interfere with each other and fight and have all of this conflict, you might be an anti-federalist. Or Patrick Starr.
We should take Bikini Bottom and push it somewhere else!
Should also be noticed the Anti-Federalists weren't big fans of the fact that this new federal government would have the power to tax. I mean, after all, they did just fight a revolution against a tyrannical government that had the power to tax. But the Federalists said, oh, hold up. Our big beef with the British was taxation without representation. You definitely have representation this time through the House of Representatives. So that shouldn't really be an issue. Then everyone read Article 2, which talks about the president, and some of them were a little worried about the fact that just one person would have all of this power. In fact, a lot of the Anti-Federalists said that this new president was basically another king. There were some, including Benjamin Franklin, who felt like there should be multiple executives, or like 3 presidents, because they felt power was better confined if it was divided into the hands of a few instead of just one. But Alexander Hamilton hopped in and defended the idea that there should be a single executive or a single president. He said that power was actually more easily confined when the public could hold one person accountable, because it's far easier to hold one person accountable than to hold a group accountable. Because with the group, you may not necessarily be sure who's actually to blame for there being an issue, or you may not be exactly sure who's responsible for something good happening. So Hamilton argued things would be far too confusing if we had multiple presidents. Instead, we should have one, because where the attention goes, the energy flows. Hamilton wanted this new presidency to be energetic and actually have the power to do things and enforce the law, unlike under the Articles of Confederation. And he felt if there were 3 presidents, they would likely undermine each other and nothing would ever get done. So that's why he wanted a single executive, a single person who would have the power to actually do stuff and get stuff done without anyone else getting in the way. Well, except maybe Congress. And this brand new thing in Article 3 called the Supreme Court. And even with the Supreme Court, the Anti-Federalists had some problems with it. They liked the idea that there was another branch and power was divided and separated, but they were worried that this small group of judges on the Supreme Court might make decisions for an entire nation of millions of people. And to them, that was kind of an oligarchy. But again, Alexander Hamilton jumps in and saves the day and says, hey guys, you don't have to worry about the judicial branch because they are the weakest branch of all 3. They don't actually have the ability to enforce the rulings. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. There have been examples where the Supreme Court has said something, but the executive branch, who enforces the laws and the decisions of the Supreme Court, chose to ignore them. Now, there are examples where this can be a good thing and examples where it can be a bad thing. An example of where this could be a bad thing was the one I gave you a couple weeks ago, where Andrew Jackson decided to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling, which told him that he couldn't kick the Indians out on the Trail of Tears, but he ignored him and just did it anyway. An example of where it was a good thing was the Dred Scott decision. If you remember from history class, the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision basically held that if a slave ran away to the North, they were still their master's property. They were not free, which meant that slave masters could run up into the North, capture their slaves, and bring them back. Many of the northern states decided to nullify the Supreme Court's ruling. That means they chose to ignore it and not enforce it. Many northern states, if they came across a runaway slave, would actually hide that slave or assist that slave from evading the slave catchers. So in one situation, the inability of the Supreme Court to actually enforce their own ruling was probably a bad thing, because it meant that the president kicked out a bunch of Indians and a lot of them died on the Trail of Tears. On the other hand, the inability of the Supreme Court to enforce their ruling in the Dred Scott decision gave birth to the Underground Railroad, where a lot of states just simply ignored the court's ruling and saved a lot of runaway slaves from being taken back down into captivity in the South. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists both went back and forth, arguing over whether or not the Constitution should be ratified. And the nation was actually pretty divided at that time. So upon seeing this gridlock, Lil Jimmy Madison had an idea, and he approached the Anti-Federalists and said, hey, listen, I actually really sympathize with a lot of the arguments you guys are making about this central government having too much power that might abuse the rights of the people. So I tell you what, if we ratify the Constitution, I promise that we will add on 10 amendments to the Constitution. And within these amendments, we will restrict the federal government's power to abuse certain rights. You see, because the Anti-Federalists didn't trust that checks and balances, separation of powers, and popular sovereignty would be enough to limit the government from becoming abusive, they wanted it in writing. Hey, the government is not allowed to do this to people. The government is restricted and limited from doing this to the states. But there were a lot of Federalists who said, guys, we don't need a list of restrictions for the federal government. Checks and balances, federalism, separation of powers, popular sovereignty, all of that is enough to limit government. If you make a list of things that they're not allowed to do, you're going to restrict government too much, and things are going to get confusing, because if you say government's not allowed to do this, does it then imply that they're allowed to do something maybe you forgot to put in that list? For example, if you as a student made a contract with me, the teacher, and you said, hey, Mr. Lucas, you're not allowed to punch me in the face if you get angry at me, I might say, okay, cool, but nothing in the contract said I couldn't take something and throw it at you for failing to turn in an assignment. That's the type of thing the Federalists were afraid was going to happen if the Anti-Federalists and James Madison made this long list of things the government was not allowed to do. Now, while the Federalists were not trying to create another kingship or another monarchy or dictatorship, they did want there to be a more powerful central government, and they wanted the Constitution to be purposefully vague in some areas so that the federal government would have the power to deal with uncertain events in the future. And so they didn't want any language to be restricting the government so much that it couldn't act, and there would be a situation like Shays' Rebellion again, where the government was powerless to prevent a mob of people from coming through and burning things to the ground. For you see, the Federalists were wealthy and elite. They were elitists, meaning that they believed the common everyday person was too dumb to make educated political decisions. They believed it should be left in the hands of those who were well educated. They feared that too much democracy, too much freedom, too much of a voice of the common man would cause society to devolve into chaos. Your Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were more of your farmers, your common everyday person, and they trusted their fellow man. They wanted there to be more freedom, more democracy, because they didn't trust the wealthy, educated elite to have that power and to use it wisely. They feared centralized tyranny and dictatorship more than anything else. Honestly, two very different views on human nature. Can you trust your fellow man to govern himself, or do you not trust your fellow man to govern himself? Do you trust your neighbors to govern other people, or do you not trust your neighbors to govern other people? How big should government be? How powerful should government be? Can a government be powerful enough to govern effectively in society while also preserving the rights of the people? The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists obviously both had very different perspectives on those issues, perspectives that would lead to both of them creating the first two political parties in the United States, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, who would later become known as the Democratic Republicans. Later, those two parties would eventually form into what we have today in the Republican and the Democratic parties. To make a long story short, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists ended up compromising. In exchange for the ratification of the Constitution, meaning Articles 1 through 7, the Federalists agreed that they would ratify 10 additional amendments to the Constitution called the Bill of Rights. And that's exactly what happened. After reading the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers, the state legislatures got together and they ratified the U.S. Constitution. After the Constitution was ratified, Congress then began to work on the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, if you zone out at all in the last 5 or 10 minutes, let me allow Justice Neil Gorsuch to explain to you why we have the Bill of Rights, as he was asked during his Senate confirmation hearing a few years ago.
The Constitution's a negative document. It is not the government giving us freedoms. It is us giving the government a limited set of enumerated powers. And originally there was no Bill of Rights. And as a part of a compromise, we added one. Today, most people, when they think about our Constitution, think of the Bill of Rights first. Why do we have a Bill of Rights, and what fundamental difference would it make if we didn't have one?
The Constitution, as a negative document, the theory behind it, in short order, was to divide power, the better to protect liberty. That's the theory. That you put all power in one set of hands, you're going to get tyranny. And our founders had too much evidence of that in their own time. It's kind of a hard-won inheritance. Part Enlightenment theory, right? Part on the battlefield. They saw what it was like to have power amalgamated in one set of hands. Dangerous. So they divided it. They divided it 3 ways in our federal system. You, Article 1, write the laws. And it's tough. It's supposed to be tough to protect liberty. We don't just have one house, we have 2 houses. And then it has to be signed by the president, too. Really hard. Bicameralism and presentment is designed to make legislation difficult, the better to protect liberty. The president's powers are to execute the laws, not make them, not adjudicate disputes. Our role is to decide cases and controversies between the people under law as it is, not as we'd wish it to be. We're not legislators, we're judges. The legislative power is invested in this body. That's not all. Then we divide power in a way that was quite unique, well, unusual. Federalism. So you can think of separation of powers as having a horizontal access and a vertical access, so that the federal government has certain enumerated powers and authorities. And what the federal government doesn't enjoy, the states do, as sovereigns. This country as well, we have tribes, which also bear sovereignty in our part of the world and bear recognition as such. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to recognize that fact here as a Westerner. So we have the separation of powers between horizontally and vertically. And that wasn't thought enough to protect liberty. The drafters of the Constitution, many of them thought that that would be more than sufficient, that that in fact was the main way to preserve liberty. But our founders were very suspicious and very jealous of their liberties. So they added the Bill of Rights, and they enumerated 10 of them, as you know, starting with the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, no establishment of religion, right to bear arms. The Third Amendment, which I'm glad we don't litigate much. I wonder how many of the high school kids now watching know what the Third Amendment's about. Go look it up.
Don't worry, Judge Gorsuch. We'll learn that one and the rest of the Bill of Rights as we start on that next. So your assignments for this week, obviously no surprise here. You got 2 ed puzzles, both of which are due on Wednesday, and then a Google form, which is due on Thursday. One quick reminder with ed puzzles. Please make sure that you click submit on Google Classroom, because that's how I get a notification that you've completed it, especially if it's late. So do make sure that you click submit on Google Classroom as well after you complete the ed puzzle. I've also decided to throw in a bonus assignment since the presidential election is next Tuesday, November 3rd. So on this website that I have linked in Classroom under this assignment, it takes you to 270 to win. And there you can create a map predicting how you think the election is going to turn out in the Electoral College. I will also post a link to some websites where you can take a look at how Biden and Trump are doing in each of the 50 states to help you make a good prediction. The idea is that after November 3rd, you can take a look at the Electoral College map and see how close you were to predicting predicting who was going to win the election and who was going to win each state. If you take a screenshot of your final prediction and upload it into Google Classroom under that assignment, I will give you 5 bonus points for that. So again, it's optional, but it might be worth checking it out. That'll do it for this week. Have a great week.